When it comes to breaststroke kicking, knee position absolutely matters. However, it's not about achieving a perfect, optimal, or a magical knee width. It's about following fundamental principles that need to be adapted to individual swimmers to help them create as much propulsion as possible. Hi everyone, Andrew here, helping you help your swimmers get faster. There's a lot of opinion about how wide swimmers' knees should be when they kick in breaststroke. However, when you look at elite breaststrokers, you tend to see a range of effective knee widths that seem to produce really fast swimmers across that spectrum. When you look at the commonalities between those swimmers, what you see is that they're always putting their knees in a position that allows them to create a lot of propulsion with the legs. In just about every single case, the knees are slightly wider than the hips and the feet are wider than the knees. That puts swimmers in position where they can create a big surface area with their whole foot and the bottom part of their shin, and they can create a lot of force in that position that moves water backwards. Because swimmers have different ranges of motion in the hips, the knees, the ankles, as well as different limb lengths, and of course, they have different amounts of strength, different swimmers are going to need to find a different knee position in order to create as much propulsion as possible. When you have a better understanding of what swimmers need to do to create propulsion, it's a lot easier to adapt that kick to different swimmers. Let's take a look at those fundamental principles and how the application of those principles is slightly different from swimmer to swimmer. Now, if we take a look at this swimmer here, what we're going to see is that the knees are wider than the hips. That's going to allow them to be in a good position to create a lot of force. And then the feet end up wider than the knees, and that's going to put them in a position to move a lot of water backward. If the feet aren't wider than the knees, it's very difficult to get the whole foot facing backwards and get part of that shin, the lower part of the shin, facing backwards too, and then moving straight back from that position. And so if you watch what happens with the knees, the most important thing is not so much the absolute width, it's the width relative to the hips and the feet. So as you can see in this swimmer, it's almost like a W where the feet are wide, the knees are in the middle, and then the hips are narrow. That's going to be the key position that swimmers get in. How wide they get can differ depending on their range of motion and their strength. However, the knees are going to be wider than the hips, if only slightly, and then the feet are going to need to be wider than the knees. And if we watched this swimmer here as well, what we'll see is another key aspect is that the knees, once they set up, once the kick starts, the knees do not slide out. They stay in that same position. The swimmer kicks back, and then once the kick is finished, the knees still haven't moved. It's once the kick is finished, that's when things come back together. That position is maintained throughout the kick. If the knees start sliding out, swimmers are going to lose their ability to maintain pressure on the water. They're going to lose the effectiveness of the kick. And sliding out isn't pushing water backwards, it's sliding around the water. So again, it's all about creating an effective position to move water backwards and to do so strongly within the limitation of the swimmer's anatomy. So the swimmer has to get the feet wider than the knees a little bit wider than the hips, and then from that position, they're going to kick straight back. The knee position is going to stay stable until the kick finishes, and then the knees are going to slide in. And so again, it might be narrower, it may be wider, but it's going to depend on the ability of the swimmer to get into those positions effectively. Some swimmers are going to have to be wider, some swimmers are going to have to be narrower, some swimmers are going to be in between. If a swimmer can't get into effective positions with a really narrow kick, they're not going to be effective at doing that. They have to be a little bit wider in order to get the feet set up and in order to execute a strong kick. So here we'll take a look at two different breaststrokers that have a slightly different kick. The swimmer on the left is going to have a little bit narrower kick, we can see right there, and then the swimmer on the right is going to have a little bit wider kick. But what we want to pay attention to is that in both cases, the setup of the kick, the knees are wider than the hips, we can see that on the right, and then the feet are wider than the knees. Again, we see that on the right, and the same thing on the left, the knees are wider than the hips, and the feet are wider than the knees. And then from that position, they kick straight back. So again, just like the previous swimmer, they're assuming the same basic positions. They're getting the feet wide, the knees wide of the hips, And then from there, they're kicking straight back. They're not letting the knees drift out during the kick, and they're being very direct with the kick. And so even though these swimmers are using a slightly different kick in terms of the range of motion and the position of the knees, the same basic principles are the same. We'll see the same thing with these swimmers here. If we watch the two swimmers in the foreground of the video, the swimmer on the left is going to have a little bit wider kick, and the swimmer on the right is going to have a narrower kick. And this is a perfect snapshot of that. In both cases, we can see that the knees are wider than the hips and that the feet are wider than the knees, but the swimmer on the left has a wider kick than the swimmer on the right. But when they actually kick, knees stay in position and the feet move straight back. So again, same idea, same principles, same concepts, but a slightly different application based on the individual. Both cases, they're able to set up a kick that moves a lot of water backwards, and they're able to set up a kick that's very direct, but they're going to need to do that with a different strategy because they probably have differences in range of motion, they have differences in limb length, they have differences in strength. It's hard to know exactly what those differences are and the impact that they have, but we can see that they're choosing to apply those principles in a slightly different way, and that's going to result in a slightly different kick. But the concepts are the same. Feet wider than knees, knees wider than hips, kicking straight back, not letting the knees drift out. So the danger can be in trying to model a different swimmer if the swimmer that you're trying to help doesn't have the same physical characteristics as the model swimmer. They're simply not going to be able to get in positions as effectively. And while they'll still need to use the same principles, they're going to have to apply those principles in a slightly different way. So rather than trying to find the optimal kick width, it's understanding what needs to happen for an effective kick and then helping swimmers determine the effective positions that are going to help create the most propulsion for them. If you want to learn more about how to develop a powerful breaststroke kick, check out the video below.